Hello, everyone. Today we again welcome Dr. Borovkin in our Aspect TV YouTube show, and we will be discussing different geopolitical issues. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz' call to President Vladimir Putin is much debated around the world. German Chancellor was approached by the Zelensky not to contact President Putin, but he ignored any warnings and go ahead with calling President Putin. Dr. Brovkin, you know that Germany is the biggest supplier of weapons to Ukraine to continue their war efforts. And at the same time, these diplomatic efforts, how do you make any sense out of that?
Yes, thank you. It's a very good question. Yes, we should look at this telephone call first and foremost in the context of domestic politics in Germany,
Mm-hmm.
because Scholz doesn't have anything particularly new to say to Putin. Even if he had, he would have to be cleared first with NATO allies and with the United States. And now that the United States is in between two presidents, it really nobody can give him anything certain. So it's really his own move, and it is for domestic audience in Germany. So what does he want to show to the German electorate? He wants to show, it's my view, that he is the one who can talk to Mr. Putin, as opposed to others. For example, his foreign minister, Madame Baerbock of the Greens, is a hawk. She keeps on repeating how Ukraine is going to get Russian frozen assets and Ukraine is going to get this and that. In other words, her position, nobody would even talk to her in Moscow. She would probably, not even Lavrov, I think, would agree to discuss because there's nothing to talk about. Her position is clear. She's among those who want to defeat Russia militarily. Scholz is a little different. He's on record of refusing to allow Taurus missiles to be transferred to Ukraine. And he positioned himself in Germany saying that he wants to support Ukraine because supposedly Russia is an aggressor, but he doesn't want to let Germany be dragged, as he put it, this is his words, into a bigger war. So that's his political position. Now, why is that important? It's important because there will be, his coalition fell apart and there will be elections on the 23rd of February. And in the constellation of political forces, SPD, the party that he heads, is very, very weak.
Mm-hmm.
Partly because of the terrible economic conditions that Germany finds itself in. And to tell you the truth, it's really not his fault, because these problems have accumulated over years. And the biggest problem, of course, that the Germans are afraid to speak about, everybody knows it, but it's a kind of a taboo that nobody wants to talk about, except Alternative for Germany and Sarah Wagenknecht. I'll explain those two. But the German problem is very simple. No cheap energy. That's it. Germany is or has been, or is still is, but in tremendous difficulties because Germany has the best and the biggest, for example, chemical industry in the world.
Mm-hmm.
BASF and many other companies. So, and for that, you need a lot of energy. And Russia provided cheap gas and cheap oil. How cheap? This is from, I listened to the proceedings of Bundestag, and they say themselves, their leaders, that American liquefied gas is 4 times more expensive than the Russian one. 4 times. That makes them uncompetitive, especially because China gets Russian cheap gas and the Germans don't. So
Okay.
that makes them, very, very painful. In other words, Germany is in trouble. That's not Scholz's fault. This all started before him, even though the special military operation started when he was there, but he could have reacted differently. I mean, he took a position outright for the Ukraine instead of trying to be a bridge. In any case, what to do about this? In this political context, his main opponent or competitor for power, the leader of the SDU, or Christian Democrats, Mr. Merz,
Mm.
he is on record of coming with an even more anti-Russian statement. He said that if Putin would not stop bombing, he, Merz, would send Taurus missiles and it would change the course of the war. Now, it's not going to change any course of the war, but it's a very provocative, very anti-Putin statement. So, in this context, Scholz wants to position himself that he can be a peacemaker. He supports Ukraine, sort of that's to you and to them, a kind of in the middle. Now, whether this will work and whether that would gain him any support is not clear, but at least it explains why he is trying to create this opening for himself as a negotiator or a promoter of negotiations with Putin on peace in Ukraine.
Do you see other European countries also, wanted to open up for Moscow? Because you mentioned the cheap, gas from Russia, and the other day, Ursula speaking in Budapest, still advocating to buy the, LNG from United States. So, what do you think? How the transatlantic relations will evolve in coming days? While there is a lot of dissent among the European masses, what is happening in that country, like the political chaos, economical deterioration, and all these things?
Yes, very good question. Again, I prefer to look at the big picture and processes that are independent of what he said, what she said, what this person said, what this person said. The
Mm-hmm.
sort of objective reality on the ground is that Europe is in decline economically. It's becoming less and less competitive. That's number one, especially Germany. Number two is that Trump is no longer in the mood to give what he considers to be free ride to Europe, which means that if not an economic war, but at least a
Mm-hmm.
tough competition is on the way, maybe even sanctions. And Trump has been on record of doing that. I remember one time there was something against French wine, and everybody in America started breaking French wine bottles and so forth, and saying we can live without French cheese, etc. So whatever Trump may do, it's going to be America first, and it's going to be a tough
Yes.
competition with Europe. Now, the advantage of the United States is that it does have its own energy.
Mm-hmm.
Because of fracking, it actually has more than it needs, and it exports it at a very high price to Europeans. The
Mm-hmm.
Europeans don't have energy. That's the fact. They have to import it either from the Middle East or from Russia. And it's the cheapest and the quickest from Russia. But under the leadership of Ms. von der Leyen, they don't want to. They refused. And the German government went along. But how long they will be able to resist it, I don't know. I don't think it's tenable in the long term because it takes a couple of years for the hurt to be felt. But now everybody sees it. Volkswagen closing its plants in the. Even agriculture cannot live without Russian fertilizers. So now the European industry is beginning to feel the effects of their own choices.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are those in Europe, such as Hungary, regardless of Mr. Orban's position in terms of Ukraine war, but even before that, he wants to get Russian gas, and he openly said it. We are getting it through Serbia, through the so-called Turkish hub.
Mm-hmm.
So one line of Russian gas was blown up. That's the one that goes to Germany.
Mm-hmm.
One line is still open, but the Germans refuse to use it because of this political pressure. But the other line goes through Turkey to Greece and then through Macedonia to Serbia and Hungary. And I think from there also to Austria. So the Balkans and the southeast of Europe is getting Russian gas, and they're fine with it, and they're openly fine with it. I mean, Urban, under whatever pressure von der Leyen and the European Commission is exercising on him, refuses to budge. He says, no, our economy needs it, and we're going to continue to buy Russian gas. So this is a kind of a split on Northern and Southern Europe. Southern Europe is more inclined politically to work with Russia and economically to buy Russian oil and gas, whereas Northern Europe is much more hawkish, especially Britain, France, and less so, but also Germany and Finland and Poland and Sweden. So that's the kind of divide that is now splitting Europe along the lines of how to deal with Russia.
Okay. Thank you for explaining all these, crucial issues. So Russia is intensifying its influence in Africa and, on the global South region to get more and more, political and economical support. And Western, bloc is really worried about that. So what do you think? Because they were totally want to isolate Russia, but you see the successful, Kazan summit and the support from the global South. Russia is emerging as a, as a renewed power. How the Western Bloc is, worried about that, and how they have failed to isolate Putin, especially when the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz called to the President Putin, how it is, viewed in among the other European, counterparts.
Yes, yes. I'll talk about Africa first, and then the second part about how the
Sure,
Europeans view Scholz's call. Now,
sure.
about Africa, what really is again the big picture, regardless of whoever says what. The big picture is that there are Ethiopia, South Africa are members of BRICS already. Algeria wants to very much and is sort of in line. At least it's definitely going to be one of those partner countries.
Mhm.
So this is like a very, very close relationship of Russia with these African countries. And these are very important countries and very populous countries. I think
Mhm.
Ethiopia alone is 120 million people. Russia is 150. So it's a pretty serious, big, growing, potentially a very important country, again, strategically situated between Middle East and Africa in a very important position. So now also there is this Wagner group and its influence in Central Africa, which amazingly achieved quite a lot of influence for Russia. And I live in France, and I think it's just incredible for the French public to see Africans in Central Africa with the portraits of Putin and Russian flags at the time when they're chasing the French out and the
Mhm.
French bases are closed. And I think also this is one of the reasons that Macron is so anti-Russian now. I think
Okay.
that this sort of stab in the back is this kind of Russian, from the French point of view, aggressive pushing of France out of its sphere of influence is something that is another sort of object of contention between France and Russia. By the same token, the Russians are saying, now, what are you doing in Ukraine? I mean, it seems like in 1853, you tried once to get us out of Crimea, and now you never learned anything. So Crimea is ours and Ukraine is Russia. And therefore you're messing in our region. Well, we're messing in your region, something like this. So, but this is pretty much goes in not only to hurt Macron, but it's a kind of the way I think Putin looks at it is that it's a continuation of anti-colonial struggle. It's a
Okay.
continuation of a policy to enable the Africans to be more independent. And the Soviet Union was too weak and couldn't really offer much except military advice and Kalashnikov weapons. Russia now is becoming to have some clout economically. And that's new because Russia was never in that position before. What can Russia offer except for oil and gas? Now it can offer much more. It can offer nuclear power stations, which are
Mhm.
quite good. It can offer military technology. It can also offer food. Russia is the #1 exporter of grain, and African countries need it. And they need it so much that no persuasion from anybody. If you are hungry and you can get not very expensive grain, you're going to buy it no matter what Americans say or don't say.
Definitely.
This is a very important factor, that Russia is an exporter of grain. Now, of course, you can get high tech from the Chinese, and that would be better and cheaper than the Russian ones. But the Russians have already gained some sort of a certain markets as a niche for their products. And some of them are quite competitive and cheap, like tractors and cars, cheapo types, and all kinds of machines for factories and things that are quite good for African countries. And they've been quite effective in building those infrastructure projects. Now, about the second part, what's so interesting is that the Western leaders, Steinmeier and Macron and others, of course, are not pleased at all that the United West is broken, and that Trump is talking about negotiations, and now Scholz is talking about negotiations. So, because it's amazing to see how Rutte, the head of NATO, keeps on talking about victory and about supplying as long as necessary. Just the talk hasn't changed at all. It's so interesting, but as if he has some power. He doesn't have any power. The power over NATO is with the United States. That's it. The Secretary General of NATO is like Secretary General of the United Nations. He has no power, zero, nothing. Just a kind of a bureaucrat who is in charge of moving papers. No substantive decisions depend on him. In the United Nations, it's the Security Council, and in NATO, it is the Pentagon and the American president. So what he says is irrelevant. But the fact that they're talking in a different tone, one says negotiations, the other say help to Ukraine no matter what, however long it takes, that means there is a discord. That means the European leaders of the G7 don't know how to deal with Trump. It hasn't sunk in yet that something new is going to happen. Nobody knows what Trump will do, how it will go, but the rift is obvious. The rift is absolutely obvious in mentality and in the very approach to Ukrainian problem.
Yes, you're right. So the Overseas Development Institute has reported that Russia has increased up to 70% in their defense budget. And all this, uncertainty looming on the donor countries for Ukraine, how Ukraine is, seeing all these developments where, there are significant, portion of the European countries are also, thinking about their own problems rather than thinking about the Ukraine.
Yes, indeed. I think the Ukrainian government, which pretty much is Zelensky, Yermak, and this whole group of people around him, they are. I watch actually quite attentively every day the Ukrainian press and Ukrainian media and what they're saying and things like that. So what could be seen quite clearly is that Zelensky is in a shock, and he does not even know what to do and how to respond. Because he keeps on talking about the just peace, so that it sounds like he's for peace, okay, for negotiations. But when he defines just peace, it means just when he gets all the Ukrainian territory back, even though it's not Ukrainian, even though the people who live there are Russian, even though they don't want to be in Ukraine, even though if it were in Ukraine, there was no way he can govern Russian-speaking territories. It hasn't come yet to his mind that it's lost forever. He doesn't know that. He cannot accept this. But it has political ramifications, because if he continues to insist that just peace means all of Ukraine territories, then it actually makes quite convenient for Mr. Putin to continue the offensive, because he'll say, look, they don't want to, even if Trump says, let's do negotiations. What is there to negotiate if Zelensky says no?
Mhm.
Therefore, there are now forces in Ukraine that are beginning to say things they were afraid to say even a month ago. And I watch it. There are in the Rada, which is their parliament, there are people now who are beginning to articulate criticism of the vicious, brutal mobilization campaign when seizing young men on the streets. They're beginning to criticize it. They're beginning to criticize even the very approach to the war, that people are tired. They're not saying we're against the war, but they're saying people are tired, which is less provocative, that people want peace. You can't arrest somebody for saying people want peace, even if it is a kind of a political concessions. So yes, there are politicians in Ukraine who are positioning themselves to, as they say, Karasev is one of them, that whatever remains of Ukraine, it needs to be governed and it needs
Mhm.
to put Humpty Dumpty together again, and we need to move on, and we
Mhm.
need to find something for our people, which means restoration of industry and
Mhm.
investment, and sort of govern the ruined country which this irresponsible president has brought in. However, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because Russia is not going to sign anything with Zelensky
Mhm.
because he's not legitimate. Because somebody 2 years from now could say, well, this guy wasn't elected. I don't care what he signed. So, what Putin has been saying all along, it has to be not even of course, it has to be a legitimate Ukrainian president, but that's only the first step. What Russia wants is international treaty. It has to
Mhm.
be an international treaty, pretty much like Helsinki Accords of 1976, which defined the borders in Europe, or like Yalta in 1945, or as some kind of a multilateral treaty of all European security and borders. That's what it wants. Maybe along the lines of an Austrian treaty, which is still in effect, and Austria is internationally recognized uh, neutral country. In other words, it doesn't have a free choice of changing and one day say Austria, we want to be a member. They cannot be a member of NATO.
Yes. Yes.
It's by international treaty.
Mhm.
Whereas Finland actually decided to change its mind, and there is no international treaty that says Finland must be neutral. It was
Mhm.
their choice, and they can walk out of their choice. Austria cannot. It's an international treaty, just like the one that divided Germany into four zones.
Mhm.
So this is probably what Putin is after. And for that, you need the consent of NATO, and that means of the British and the French and the Germans and major European powers, including Poland. And these people are not ready. They have not yet, it has not yet sunk in what the new situation is. And even if Trump is ready, and even if Putin is ready, and even if there's a new government in Ukraine that is elected, they're talking about elections in May. Even that is not good enough unless European leaders are ready to sit down and negotiate a new international security treaty, including Ukraine in its new borders. That is what the Russian side wants. And whether they're going to get it, we don't know. Probably not. The way it looks now, it's probably not. Unless Trump is so powerful that he convinces the G7 partners that you need to actually finish this war, not just by ceasefire, but by actual international treaty so that the issue is resolved and we can focus on trade and on China and Middle East and so on.
Yeah, President Trump's election has, changed a lot of dynamics, but still he has to take office, in January. So we have reports coming from Washington that the current administration is considering to, allow Ukrainians, the decommissioned Taiwanese Hawk anti-craft missiles to bolster their, efforts against Russia. So between this transitional time, do you see there might be a escalation in this conflict?
Yes, there could be an escalation, indeed, because the Biden administration uh, just lost elections.
Mhm.
And American people want them be first. And
Mhm.
it's just such an arrogance on the part of Biden to say that in the remaining time, they want to ship $7 billion to Ukraine.
Uh,
7 billion. Now, for 7 billion, you can actually help a lot of people who lost their homes in all these hurricanes and fires in California. No, that's not a priority. The priority is to help the Ukrainians. Now, most important thing is, of course, let me put it very bluntly. None of that money would make any difference. It's going to wind up in Swiss banks, in offshore accounts of
mhm.
Mr. Zelensky and his uh, to put it politely, government. Uh, that's the thing. There's nothing you can do with this. There's only that much military hardware that is being produced, and it's much less than is actually available. Americans cannot give their own patriots because they need it for themselves and for the Israelis because of these uncertain times. But not even if they transfer another bunch of patriots to Ukraine, it's not going to change the situation on the front line. That's the thing. I heard Russian generals, I watched their discussion regularly, and
Mhm.
they say that the active part of the fighting in Donbass is only 100,000. And the Russian army on the Ukrainian Russian lines is 700,000. And only 100,000 is actively advancing, which
Mhm.
means a lot of these forces are held in reserve in case of whatever may happen. And the Russians are creating totally two new armies that's going to be put in the north against Finland, Sweden, and Poland. Totally new army. The goal of President Putin is to have 1,800,000 Russian army by 2026. This is the result of this war. They don't want to make any chances of being unprepared for anything NATO can throw against them. So the objective picture is that the Russian military is winning this war, and it's only a question how far they will decide. Not that any amount of weapons the United States is going to give them is going to make any difference. It's not going to make any difference. The Russians are going to achieve their objectives, and these objectives only Mr. Putin knows what they are, regardless of how much money is wasted by transferring these hardware and millions to Zelensky and his friends.
Yes, so economical and humanitarian strains are, evident on, Ukraine, and you rightly mentioned that here in United States, they can use this money anywhere where they want it to. People are suffering, homeless people are here, uh, as you mentioned, the floods and other hurricanes, but they still, channeling this money to Ukraine, and we see on the ground many people does not understand this notion what is going on. Can you briefly explain how Russia is dealing with this internally displaced people inside Russian territory?
Uh, they mean from Ukraine war or
Yes, yes, yes.
uh, yeah. Well, this is a long story, and there's a lot of changes occurred because um, a couple of years ago, uh, Putin used to make all these 4 hour long live conferences with callers, Russian citizens calling. And there was one embarrassing one, I remember it myself, when a woman from Donbass,
Mm-hmm.
at that time, it was before the beginning of the war, she called and said that they were refugees from Donbass. They had Ukrainian passports and they crossed over to Rostov Oblast, and they had a very hard time getting papers and permits, and she was suffering. And she said, there are many of us like this. We're refugees from this war, and you supposedly support us, but we can't get anything. So what I remember Putin did, right on live on air, he put a phone call to the local governor
Mm-hmm.
and ordered him to take action. And then they changed the law that those citizens of Donetsk and Lugansk could automatically get Russian passports. And so this improved the situation. Now, of course, now the Russians claim that there are 3 million Ukrainian citizens on the Russian territory. These are refugees. I hear a lot from Ukrainians in Ukraine. Some of them write comments to me and other ways of information that it's very, very difficult to get into Russia from Ukraine because there is this front line and it's very, very hard to cross it. So the only way that is still possible for them is to go to Belarus and then from Belarus to Russia.
Okay.
Or to Europe, and then from Europe to Turkey, and then from Turkey to Russia. So these are the two ways that are still possible, but it's very hard from Ukraine to go anywhere now, including to Europe, if men are not allowed to leave at all, and the border guards seize them and they're trying to run away through the forests and so on. And then women usually wait for their men before they go anywhere. So at this point, there's very, very little that movement of these displaced persons. Some of them, despite all the bombs and everything, remain in their villages, hiding in all kinds of self-made shelters and waiting for the Russian troops. And the television shows how these old babushkas come out and so happy to see the Russians come in. Now, it's also important for your listeners to understand, once the Russian army comes in, the people in these territories automatically, the next day, can receive Russian passports and have all the same rights as everybody else, because Donbass is officially already a part of the Russian Federation,
yes,
including Zaporozhye and Kherson. So, but there are no Russian troops on, except for a small part of the Kharkov province, which is officially not Russia. So these are like Ukrainians. But so far, everywhere they go, it's Russian territory. And that means that they don't need to go anywhere. They can stay put and then hope that reconstruction teams are going to come and start rebuilding their villages and towns, as they have done in Mariupol. So that's the story.
Yeah, Dr. Brovkin, we appreciate your expertise and, valuable insights on these issues. We will continue talking about these issues till our next video. Goodbye from our studio.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.